order to understand nuclear proliferation and disarmament in today's world, we first need to discuss the 9 nuclear powers. These include the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. It's important to note that not all of these nations have publicly admitted to the possession of nuclear weapons, and in general, there's a lot of ambiguity around the amounts of and advancements within these nuclear programs. Nuclear weapons are often credited to making a nation powerful, as they have the ability to use them against other nations. However, technology, a large military expenditure, and expertise are all required in order to develop nuclear weapons. This is why it can also be argued that it is not the nuclear weapons that make a nation powerful, as they already had to be powerful in the first place in order to develop them.
The first nuclear weapon was developed in the United States under the Manhattan Project, which officially began in 1942. The first and only time a nuclear bomb has been used in a conflict was in 1945, when the US dropped Little Boy and Fat Man on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. With the emergence of the Cold War and the accompanying arms race, however, the importance of nuclear weapons became even more significant. Thus, the Soviet Union quickly followed the United States and conducted its first nuclear test in 1949. Just 3 years later, in 1952, the UK followed and the US tested its first hydrogen bomb. During the 60s, the numbers of countries possessing nuclear weapons increased further. France conducted its first nuclear test in 1960, followed by China 4 years later. It is also believed that Israel developed its first nuclear bomb in 1967. Towards the end of the Cold War, also non-aligned states started to develop nuclear weapons. India, for example, tested its first atomic bomb in 1974. And in an attempt to challenge India, Pakistan developed its first nuclear bomb in 1998. And most recently, North Korea announced it has tested nuclear weapons successfully in 2006. Today, the above-mentioned countries are the only countries with nuclear strike capability. With the end of the Cold War, the number of warheads decreased significantly, especially the US and Russia have worked on nuclear disarmament. They still possess by far the most nuclear weapons, however. On the other hand, the history of resistance against nuclear weapons is almost as old as the weapon itself. In 1946, only 3 months after its foundation, the UN called for the elimination of atomic bombs. On the other hand, the history of resistance against nuclear weapons is almost as old as the weapon itself. In 1946, only 3 months after its foundation, the United Nations General Assembly called for the elimination of atomic weapons in its first resolution. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, various treaties were signed to limit testing of nuclear weapons. For example, the Antarctica Treaty banned any nuclear explosion from Antarctica. Various continents and countries have also committed to prevent the proliferation of these weapons. Today, Latin America, Australia, South and Southeast Asia, Africa and Antarctica are considered nuclear-free.
There are 2 types of power: soft power, which according to the Oxford Dictionary is a persuasive approach to international relations, typically involving the use of economic or cultural influence, and brutal power, that is a more cruel and ruthless approach of being convincing that involves the use of military power. So when we talk about nuclear proliferation, it's a form of brutal power because of being in possession of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, by disarming a nation, one's hard power decreases. Achieving disarmament requires mobilizing international civil society soft power resources. Therefore, by disarming oneself and thus decreasing the hard power, a nation has the chance to focus on increasing its soft power. Although soft power may not sound as appealing in terms of influence and success, it is very important in shaping a country to be credible and influential. A country may obtain the outcomes it wants in the politics world because other countries admire its values, copy its example, and aspire to its level of prosperity and openness. This soft power of getting others to want the outcomes that you want co-opts people rather than coerces them. And this is where the real power comes from. Accordingly, we can see that 3 of the top 6 most powerful countries in the world, which are the US, Russia, China, Germany, United Kingdom, and France, currently are also in the top 5 countries with the most soft power in the world as of this year. Now, when we mention this idea of power, it's also good to have a global idea in international relations, such as changes in warfare over time, as well as how some states are more fragile than others. The World Bank does provide a good definition, observing such states as sharing a common fragility in two particular respects. States' policies and institutions are weak in these countries, thus making them vulnerable in their capacities to deliver services to their citizens, to control corruption, or to provide for sufficient voice and accountability. They face risks of conflict and political instability, thus making these states highly vulnerable to any type of threats from other nations.
As we can learn from Morgenthau's theories, armament is one of the methods in which the balance of power is maintained. While it is not the most important method, which is alliances, nuclear weapons definitely has a strong impact on the balance of power, as a nation's enemy or ally having nuclear weapons can be a strong motivation to also develop them. Nuclear power is undoubtedly the strongest possible form of armament, as this weapon of mass destruction can not only cause immense and destructive damage immediately, but it will also create lasting effects due to the radiation. Therefore, simply the implied threat that comes with owning nuclear weapons is enough for a nation to be considered an extremely powerful force.
Additionally, with this idea of power, the neo-realist political scientist Waltz has come up with a few theories himself. In his book, Man, the State and War, Waltz discusses his point of view regarding war, that no one ever ends up a winner and that everyone just suffers at different levels. He also goes on to say that the root of all evil is man, and thus he is himself the root of the specific evil, war. Therefore, saying that any attempt to eliminate war is useless and that humankind should instead ask to have peace more often. Another theory coming from Waltz is that imbalance of power between states varies, and that the inequality of states is what makes peace and stability within nations, in which Sophie will dig more into the balance of power later on. Additionally, in Waltz's reading, War and Change in World Politics, the neo-realist states that the theory that power is the most important factor in international relations, and that structural constraints are what causes change in the world and its politics.
Using one of Waltz's models, namely the balance of threats, the having of nuclear weapons can be the basis of an alliance. A smaller or less economically developed nation may not have the military expenditure to invest in nuclear weapons themselves, and therefore they might try to strike an alliance with a nation that does have them. We can see this phenomenon in countries such as Germany, Japan, and South Korea, who all rely on their allies' nuclear weapons. Some problems that might arise with nuclear weapons is regarding Snyder's theory about the security dilemma. As one nation starts developing nuclear weapons in order to increase their national security, other nations may perceive this as a threat. It presents a paradox in which one nation sees their own weapons as a security measures, but their neighbors' weapons are an immediate threat. To use real-life examples, we can see this in the history of the Cold War, where this threat of the nuclear weapons may have played a role in avoiding direct conflict, but it also increased tensions on both sides of the United States, as well as the Soviet Union. As one nation produces more nuclear weapons, the other is incentivized to do the same. Many countries whose rivals have nuclear weapons are highly motivated to develop them as well, such as India and Pakistan. In the current world, we can see many similar tensions, like in the Cold War, between North Korea and Japan, or Israel and many other countries in the Middle East. The nuclear arms race started becoming a threat to international security in the early 1960s, when the development of nuclear weapons became very in fashion. The proliferation was the reason that these weapons became a priority for the United Nations, and by 1968, the Treaty to Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the NPT, was established. This treaty has now been signed by 191 nations, except for South Sudan, India, Israel, and Pakistan, the last three of which own nuclear weapons currently. So while the goal of many nations is a disarmament of nuclear powers, not all nations are in agreement over this. Under the Obama administration, the United States took some big steps towards universal nuclear disarmament, calling nuclear weapons the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. The elimination of nuclear weapons by superpowers such as the United States and Russia would decrease the overall nuclear threat to the world, because extremist nations cannot use the excuse of other nations have them too anymore. Under the Chemical Weapons Treaty, which was established in 1979, the United States has already destroyed a large amount of their nuclear stockpile. However, according to the Federation of American Scientists, other nations such as China, Pakistan, and North Korea keep adding to their stock. Later in the presentation, Sophia will discuss other complications around disarmament using game theory. Another growing threat to the world's nuclear status quo and the balance of power is Iran's nuclear power program, which started in the 1950s and is suspected to be nothing but a front for the development of nuclear weapons. It is not confirmed that Iran has completed any nuclear weapons. However, the mere suspicion endangers the geopolitical implications in the Middle East. Iran is considered an arch enemy of Saudi Arabia and has publicly stated that it wants to destroy the state of Israel. Both countries are close US allies. Therefore, an Iranian nuclear bomb could trigger a domino effect, as Saudi Arabia and Israel would find their national security at risk. In 2015, a deal was set up allowing Iran to trade with other countries in exchange for the abolishment of their nuclear weapons program. However, Trump pulled out of this deal during his presidency.
In order to best understand state behavior, it's important for us to observe the processes that go into how decisions are taken. And whilst we've studied some of this in economics, international relations has its own host set of game theories that can be studied. To explain this, I will be referencing Kai He's journal entitled A Strategic Functional Theory of Institutions and Rethinking Asian Regionalism. Kai He references 4 different game theories in his text that I will 1. Summarize, 2. Tie to nuclear power, and 3. Offer real-world examples. First, we have our classic prisoner's dilemma. This is similar to the security dilemma and offense-defense balance that was talked about earlier by my colleagues. In this game, states are inherently self-interested, even though they know that cooperation is a better strategy. In the political science realm, the prisoner's dilemma is used to explain the problems behind collective action. Just like we've seen so far, states do not know what other players in the game will choose, and thus are forced to think of the worst-case scenario in regards to competitor state behaviors. So to put this into our international politics terms, military power and the realm of nuclear activity, states follow this brain tree logic behind the prisoner's dilemma. If North Korea decides to modernize itself and purchases more weapons, a rival like the United States sees North Korea as suspicious. What's their motive? Is their modernization offensive or defensive? The uncertainty of the dilemma is heightened by the aforementioned self-interested strategy of the states involved. In prisoner's dilemma terms, we can say that the dominant strategy for both states in the game is to keep purchasing more weapons for security. But both states also are fully aware that they will both be safer and better off if they can disarm or sign an agreement to decrease their usage of nuclear force overall. But the likelihood of that is very slim. The next theory to observe is the stag hunt. This one is not as commonly heard of, thus a quick summary of it in game terms. Essentially, the stag hunt deals with the issue of coordination. Working together to hunt a stag will yield the greatest reward. But the trick lies in the idea that each hunter is risking their catch as a result of what the other hunter can yield. Their overall payoff depends on how their partner both acts and reacts. This game is starkly different from the prisoner's dilemma, as here we see a high level of uncertainty and a comparatively low conflict of interest. Turning once again to our field of international politics, the stag hunt is extremely relevant to the uncertainty of states' behavior. Arguably, all states on the world stage share this common desire to tackle threats to collective security. However, they still, just like the prisoner's dilemma, do not know what the interests of the other states are. And they cannot work alone to hunt the stag because our world is so interdependent and one cannot complete that task independently. The key to this game is thus building mutual trust through things like alliances. Even more pertinent is the existence of institutions. As seen before, institutions help to reduce the overall transaction costs and are thus key to facilitating any kind of cooperation. Taking the stag hunt to the real world and putting the focal point into nuclear terms, let us look at the UN. According to the theory behind the stag hunt, UN sanctions do work if all states cooperate, because all players of the game have the incentive to choose the same dominant strategy, which is cooperation. We can thus use this logic to justify terms of disarmament, where all nations would be incentivized to choose the dominant strategy of disarmament and cooperation. Third, I'd like to turn our attention to the game of chicken theory. In this scenario, there are 2 drivers who are going right towards each other. If one of the drivers swerves to avoid the other car, he will be called the chicken of the game, but he saves the lives of both drivers. If neither driver acts as the chicken, the 2 cars crash into each other and both drivers die. In this game, there is no incentive to cooperate because the players are better off when they each choose a different strategy. Context for this game lies in a characteristically low level of uncertainty and a high level of conflict of interest. The game of chicken can be observed in IR theory in quite a few ways. First, let us assume that no state really wants to go to war because the ordeal itself is incredibly costly and destructive for the parties involved. Yet despite them wanting to avoid war, there are certain external aspects of international politics that will undoubtedly drive states to war. Institutions cannot do a lot in the game of chicken, as when states ask for help from a body as, say, the UN, it makes them seem weak. Furthermore, the role of institutions is generally to help navigate costs and the flow of information, but not to solve high-level conflicts of interest that would spark war or even the use of nuclear power. In this sense, states need to be wise about their strategy. Even more so, an institution like the UN could encourage the weaker state to swerve before conflict escalates at all. This game is kind of seen through the nuclear Cold War between the USSR and the US. Even each state is just waiting, trying to anticipate what the other may do and what the gains or losses of swerving might be, knowing that if they both choose the same strategy, all states lose. And finally, the last theory for this portion is the battle of the sexes. Assume that a couple has a date planned for the evening as there are some special events happening in their city. The problem is that both of them cannot remember what event they agreed on attending, one a boxing match, the other the opera, and at the time they cannot communicate their preference to each other. They each have a preference for which event they would like to attend, but overall they prefer to be together rather than being apart. There are thus two dominant strategies in this game. Both of them go to the boxing match or both of them go to the opera. Each person has their own ultimate gains at their preferred event. So there's low levels of uncertainty and low levels of conflict of interest in this game. International agreements themselves follow the logic behind the battle of the sexes game. Institutions play a key role here to facilitate the understanding between states to a point where both countries are in agreement with the small discrepancies in loss or benefit that each state may face. Essentially, they overcome this issue of distribution within any type of agreement, whether it be trade, military, economy, environment, etc. Certain states with hegemonic power can have more influence in these negotiations. For example, the US as a regional hegemon did this with their promotion of global trade through establishments like the World Trade Organization or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
As defined by Robert J. Art in To What Ends Military Power, in which he discusses the uses and limits of military power, there are four functions of force. Firstly, he mentions deterrence. Deterrence is the threat of force in order to discourage an opponent from taking an unwelcome action. This can be achieved through the threat of retaliation, deterrence by punishment, or by denying the opponent's war aims, deterrence by denial. For instance, mutually assured destruction, or mutually assured deterrence, also known as MAD, is a military theory that was developed to deter the use of nuclear weapons. The theory is based on the fact that nuclear weaponry is so devastating that no government wants to use them. Neither side will attack the other with their nuclear weapons because both sides are guaranteed to be totally destroyed in the conflict. No one will go all-out nuclear war because no side can win and no side can survive. To many nations, mutually assured destructions help prevent the Cold War from turning hot. To others, it is the most ludicrous theory humanity ever put in full-scale practice.
It is considered one of the 9 nuclear powers. It has never officially confirmed that it possesses nuclear weapons. Since the beginning of its nuclear program, the Israeli government has repeatedly denied inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, and even US physicists were severely limited when inspecting the Israeli nuclear plant. As leading American inspector Floyd Culler stated, it turned out that before each American visit, the Israelis built false walls around the row of lifts that descended 6 levels to the subterranean reprocessing plant. In 1968, the CIA confirmed that Israel managed to build nuclear weapons. The same year, the NPT Treaty was initiated. Thus, in 1969, Richard Nixon agreed to keep information about Israeli nuclear weapons secret and would not pressure Israel into signing the NPT. It later becomes clear that part of Israel's nuclear fuel had been stolen from a US nuclear plant. The US government keeps its policy of silence towards Israel's nuclear weapons as no one wants to deal with it for fear of opening a Pandora's box. It has in many ways become a burden for the US, but people in Washington, all the way up to Obama, will not touch it because of the fear that it could compromise the very basis of Israeli-US understanding.
In response, Egypt has threatened to quit the NPT treaty if there was no effort to create a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. However, the fact that Israel has not officially admitted the possession of nuclear weapons Negotiations about the issue are very difficult, also given that Israel is backed by the US. Israel's nuclear doctrine is therefore an open secret. Israeli officials have never confirmed nor denied the existence of nuclear weapons in Israel, and Israel's participation in non-proliferation or disarmament agreements is very limited. Furthermore, little is known about Israel's willingness to use nuclear weapons, but the mere chance of nuclear weapons possessed by Israel is a key feature of Israel's defense doctrine, as it effectively deters any hostile countries from undertaking hostile actions. Given the hostile environment Israel finds itself in, it is rather unlikely that Israel will give up this doctrine anytime soon. One example of the indirect use of Israel's nuclear capability occurred during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Being caught completely by surprise and facing defeat at the outbreak of the war, there is evidence that Israeli high command increased the readiness of its nuclear weapons. However, for what reason Israeli nuclear assets were mobilized is disputed. While some suggest the threat of going nuclear was used to deter the Arab nations from advancing further into Israeli on the one hand, and at the same time pressuring the US to provide military aid, the more common theory suggests that Israel was preparing for all eventualities. Evidence for both theories is rather limited, but this incident clearly shows the soft power of nuclear weapons. While underlining the point of deterrence, the former theory implements a new form of nuclear blackmailing. Secondly, another known function of force that he mentions is defense. Relating to that comes collective security. Collective security can be understood as a security arrangement, political, regional, or global, in which each state in the system accepts that the security of one is the concern of all, and therefore commits to a collective response to threats and breaches to peace. NATO is the best known collective defense organization. Its famous Article 5 calls on member states to assist another member under attack. This article was invoked only after the September 11th attacks on the United States, after which other NATO members provided assistance to the US war on terror by participating in the war in Afghanistan. Collective defense has its roots in multi-party alliances and entails benefits as well as risks. On the other hand, by combining and pooling resources, it can reduce any single state's cost of providing fully for its security. Smaller members of NATO, for example, have leeway to invest in a greater proportion of their budget on non-military priorities, such as education or health, since they can count on other members to come to their defense if needed. On the other hand, collective defense also involves risky commitments. Member states can become involved in costly wars, thus benefiting neither sides. For example, in World War I, countries in the collective defense arrangement known as the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, were pulled into war quickly when Russia started full mobilization against Austria-Hungary, whose ally Germany later declared war on Russia. Another function of force is compellence. Some of the dictionaries that I have looked into have defined this act of heroism. For a nation to be compellent means to stop an adversary from doing something he has already undertaken or is about to undertake, usually by threatening punishment. For example, according to the Cornell University Press, many research shows that scholars view the strategic bombing campaigns during World War II and the Vietnam War as examples of compellence, while it is another thing if the compellant attempts were successful or not. And lastly, we have swaggering as the fourth function of force. It involves only the peaceful use of force. It is a method of showing off, and it would usually be used in either one or two ways. Either during exhibition in any military national defense expo or demonstration, or by doing military exercise. One good example of swaggering can be seen from a military exhibition by Malaysia known as the Langkawi International Maritime and Aerospace Exhibition. The deployment of force in this exhibition is indirectly aims to dissuade another state from attacking, to repel attacks, or to compel it to do something specific.
It's a secretive state that is quite open about its nuclear ambitions. North Korea says it's developing an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that can deliver a nuclear warhead to the U.S. mainland, a necessary deterrent, it says, against what it calls hostile U.S. policy.
As outlined before, the main purpose of nuclear weapons is not necessarily destruction, but rather deterrence. However, Given its enormous destruction potential, the mere existence of nuclear weapons poses a constant threat to humanity. Because of that, resistance against the weapon has been considerable from the start, and many have called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Throughout the Cold War, where various states and organizations have committed to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, and the international community recognized nuclear weapons as a key issue. In 1946, the UN General Assembly stated its commitment for the elimination of nuclear weapons in a resolution that set up a committee to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy. Besides some limitations on testing during the 50s and 60s, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, were the first meaningful efforts to effectively limit the use of nuclear weapons. The first agreement, SALT I, was signed in 1972 by the US and the Soviet Union, and it limited the development of anti-ballistic missiles. By limiting each defense capabilities against nuclear weapons, less of these weapons were needed to effectively deter the opponent. SALT II was the follow-up treaty, and it limited the quantity of delivering platforms for nuclear weapons, for example, ICBMs or strategic bombers. It was signed in 1979 by Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev. However, due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the resulting tensions, it was never ratified by the US Senate. While this marks the first serious effort to pose a limitation on the nuclear threat, the SALT agreements fell very much short from the abolishing nuclear weapons. The SALT agreement's impact was limited as it did not reduce the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, nor did it prevent the enlargement of existing nuclear arsenals. In fact, the number of nuclear warheads continued to grow after the SALT agreements. In addition, negotiations were initiated by the US President Lyndon B. Johnson, not the United Nations. Therefore, the agreement depended on the acceptance from the two superpowers, and there was no punishment for leaving the agreement. In order to achieve such an agreement, both parties had to see some benefits from agreeing to the set terms. The balance of power and relative gains concerned were the main driving forces in this occasion. Complementing the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START, began in 1982. Significant results were only reached after the end of the Cold War, when tensions were considerably lower. START 1 included significant reductions of warheads and already allowed for mutual controls and inspections. START 2 included a further reduction of nuclear warheads, but was never ratified because of disputes about the anti-ballistic missile treaty, from which the US eventually withdrew in 2002. In 2003, both Russia and the US ratified the SORT, Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty Agreement, which would reduce the number of active strategic warheads to 2,200 by 2012. In 2009, START 1 would expire, and therefore in 2010 the US and Russia agreed on the new START agreement, which would further reduce the number of deployed strategic warheads. Concluding, the just mentioned agreements were only able to achieve a reduction of nuclear warheads because of a changing security environment. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the US's main rival disappeared and security concerns became less important. With the end of the fierce arms race, no country had the resources or the need to keep up such a large arsenal of nuclear weapons. What mattered, however, was the relative power between the two great powers. Therefore, it was favorable for both parties to agree on a reduction of nuclear warheads. While these treaties are bilateral agreements between the two greatest nuclear powers and therefore depend on the goodwill of the participants, there has been an international effort as well. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, represents the most important framework. It came into effect in 1970, and as of today, 191 countries have signed the treaty. States parties are put into two categories: nuclear weapon states, NWS, and non-nuclear weapon states, NNWS. Nuclear weapon states are in this occasion defined as states that manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to the 1st January 1967. This category thus includes the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. The remaining nuclear powers, India, Israel, and Pakistan, and North Korea, would have to join as non-nuclear weapon states, which would require them to dismantle their nuclear arsenal. Therefore, these countries and South Sudan are the only countries not part of the treaty. The treaty's main goal is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and complete nuclear disarmament. Besides its almost universal recognition, the NPT has also been fairly successful in containing the spread of nuclear weapons. It furthermore acts as a basis for additional treaties. The previously mentioned bilateral agreements between the US and Russia also fall in line with the NPT. However, although the number of warheads have decreased since the implementation of the treaty, we are still far from a nuclear weapons-free world. And despite the commitment of 5 nuclear powers, none of these states have publicly committed to completely dismantle their nuclear arsenal. In fact, the only country to ever give up its entire nuclear arsenal to join the treaty is South Africa. In addition, the UN itself is an institution which is more or less controlled by nuclear powers. All 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are nuclear powers. This was also part of the criticism from Mearsheimer that liberal institutions are mere power projections. Thus, the NPT treaty could also be seen as a tool of the existing nuclear powers to keep their nuclear monopoly. Concluding, the NPT treaty is the most important treaty in regards to the spread and disarmament of nuclear weapons. It forms a solid base for future treaties and agreements, but its effectiveness relies on the acceptance among individual states due to the lack of political power to enforce punishment for treaty violations. In addition, the participation in the NPT treaty has been used for political bargaining. For instance, as a protest against Israel's non-participation, Egypt refused to sign the International Atomic Energy Agency Additional Protocol. Another example of limited effect of institutions is Iran. As Sophie mentioned before, Iran is suspected of developing nuclear weapons despite being part of the NPT treaty. Although the UN Security Council passed 7 resolutions demanding Iran to stop its enrichment program, only the pressure of the P5+1 nations, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, eventually created an agreement which would become known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran Deal. This, however, required the consensus of various great powers like the US, China, Russia, and France, which is barely existent. With Trump's withdrawal, the whole deal is at risk, as the EU3, UK, France, and Germany, for instance, lack the political power to uphold the deal without the US.
It is also interesting to compare the case of Iran and Israel. As discussed earlier, Israel is considered one of the 9 nuclear countries despite the lack of any official confirmation. Israel, furthermore, is not part of the NPT treaty and thus does not take part in the international non-proliferation efforts. With extensive support from the US, there is little the international community can do to pressure Israel into such an effort. In addition, Israel receives more than $3 billion worth of aid, mostly military, from the US. Iran, a US rival, on the other hand, has no nuclear weapons yet, but is very heavily sanctioned by the UN for the attempt of building them. This again confirms Mearsheimer's criticism of liberal institutions, as any resolutions against Israel are vetoed by the US. Therefore, the US, a great power, is projecting its interests and the interests of its allies to the United Nations. This in return puts a certain bias in this decision-making of the supposedly independent United Nations, and it hinders its ability to act as a peacemaking intermediary. Instead, the US and Israel stick to a doctrine of silence about Israel's nuclear arsenal to preserve the status quo. De facto, however, the existence of nuclear weapons in Israel shifts the balance of power towards Israel. Concluding, the realist claim stands that institutions can do little to encourage cooperation, and in its anarchic system, what matters the most is power.
Finally, in conclusion, we'd like to provide a look into what the future of force and nuclear power might be. One of the most common contentions in international relations theory is the phrase military power will remain central to IR. R.J. Art defines 3 schools of thought to challenge this idea in his text, To What Ends Military Power? The first is that nuclear weapons are going to make war too conventional, and we won't see the same effective power as we did in the 20th century. The second also states that war will become outdated and unfashionable, but through the lens of man's resource curse. Essentially, this idea is that there's problems of climate change, depleting natural resources, pollution. These are all things that will not go away in our century, and thus states will need to shift their behavior to focus on these problems rather than dwell on war, which will have become too traditional. Finally, the ultimate school of thought states that modern-day states are too economically interdependent to rely on military force because nuclear destruction destroys every state, no matter how strong they appear to be. Our group agrees with the second school of thought, seeing as so many different problems are arising in our century's lifetime. With a pandemic, climate change, and other problems we may not even know about, our perception of military power and war will have to change. Whether this is for the better or worse, only time can tell. It will take a great deal of global cooperation to enact something as large as nuclear proliferation and disarmament.